I've written a gender textbook, a sociology of gender textbook, questioning gender, a nonfiction book about gender told in the style of a choose your own adventure. That's she, he, they, me. And the paperback version of that is coming out June 10th. It's got all new paths and stuff, so check that out. And then the book I'm going to be talking about today, which is Throw Like a Girl, Cheer Like a Boy, the evolution of gender, race, and identity in sports. So I'm going to aim for like about 35, 40 minutes, but people who have had me in class know that I lecture-ish. Mostly I like to have a lot of discussion, so fair warning, I will be asking you questions throughout. Please participate. Audience participation is a good thing. Just unmute yourself or raise your hand if you're, if you're all Zoom friendly. And then at the end, I'll leave questions to ask me about gender in sports, sexuality in sports, race in sports, gender in general, whatever you want to know. So I'm open to questions. Okay, so I'm going to talk about sport and gender segregation. The title of the talk is When All Cheerleaders Were Boys, so that gives you a little teaser of what we're going to be talking about. And I wanted to start out just kind of thinking about gender segregation and sports. So almost all sports, women play against women, men play against men. There are a few exceptions that we can talk about what those sports are where men and women play together. But sports is gender segregated. It's one of the last areas in life that is gender segregated. And not only is it gender segregated, but sometimes men and women aren't even playing the same sport. So for example, girls will play little league up to a certain age, and then they kind of split off and play softball, and boys play baseball. Now, that's changing a little bit. So some women are playing professional baseball. There's a woman who plays in Japan. There are a few women in the US who are in the minor leagues. There's a very interesting story from the early 20th century of a woman who was a pitcher. Her name was Vern Mitchell. And the story goes that she played for a minor league team. The Yankees were barnstorming, so they would go around and play minor league teams. And supposedly Vern Mitchell, a woman, struck out Babe Ruth. And then the next day, the baseball commissioner, Kennesaw Mountain Landis, best sports name ever, Kennesaw Mountain Landis. The next day he said, no women in baseball. So there's a kind of history of women playing baseball, but generally today, women go into softball, men go into baseball. When men and women play the same sports, often the rules are very different. So if we have anybody here who plays lacrosse or knows lacrosse, the rules for women's lacrosse are very different from the rules for men's lacrosse. The sticks are different. The field is a different size. The rules about physical contact are different. So I'm just going to throw this out to y'all. Like I said, I ask questions. Well, how would you explain that? Why do you think that men and women either play different sports or have different rules for sports, or why are sports gender segregated? What's going on there? How would you explain that? And the other thing people know who've had me in class is that I will call on you. So if nobody answers, I will call some names. What do y'all think is going on there? How would you explain what's happening with gender in sports?
I'll take a guess. Just
go ahead.
Observe differences in physicality.
Physicality? Yeah, that's that seems like
I didn't even take
obvious
the class.
Explanation. What are other folks?
This is Bridget Welch. Hey, Robyn Ryle, nice to see
Bridget.
you. I think some of it's under the guise of protecting people from sexual violence. So it's this, oh, women might be a danger if they're with men in the locker room. It's not necessarily that, but it's under that guise.
Yeah. So fear what might happen to women in mixed gender locker rooms. Yeah. So similar kind of to the other area where people still have kind of gender anxiety about gender segregation is bathrooms. So bathrooms and locker rooms. Anybody else? Yeah, Rachel?
Yeah, I think too, when I'm thinking about this situation, I think about expectations and stereotypes rooted in like public and private sphere and roles that go along with that. So public sports I see more of kind of like in the public realm, like this is a male dominated space. And then for women, you know, it's domestic and in the private sphere.
Yeah. So, and this is an issue that happens kind of in the early 20th century when women start playing sports. It's still an issue that happens in places where there are rules about kind of modesty for women. What are women going to wear when they play sports? You know, what is going to be revealed about their bodies? Who's going to watch them? Are men going to watch them, and are they going to sexualize their bodies? So yeah, sports are kind of in the public sphere, and people are watching, and women aren't supposed to kind of be watched out in the public like that. Yeah, good. Anybody else? Yeah, Beth?
I'm sorry for the delay. I think it's economics, profitability.
Yeah. So kind of going with like women's sports don't make as much money. Yeah. Yeah, and we can talk about that if you want at the end, like, you know, exactly what's happening there with so, you know, connected to audience, but how much of that is kind of self-fulfilling prophecy? You know, do people really you know, not want to watch women's sports? Exactly what's going on there. Yeah, good answers. Great job, y'all. So I'm gonna talk about make the argument that part of what's happening with sport and gender segregation is less about biological or anatomical reasons. And if you know, if we want to get into that in the questions, we can some more. But part of what's happening is social. Sport, gender segregation in sports is reinforcing the idea of gender. It's kind of helping to recreate the idea of gender. And so I'm going to focus specifically, this is the first chapter in my book about sport on cheerleading, because cheerleading has a really interesting gender history. So cheerleading today is one of the most feminine sports around. 97% of women are cheerleaders. We can get into, we'll talk throughout about the importance of language. So some people might be saying, is cheerleading really a sport? And we'll get into how whether it's considered a sport or not very much depends on who's doing it. So when women are doing it, you might get a little bit of, that's not really a sport. But when men were doing it, it kind of was seen as a sport.
Hey, Robyn.
Yeah.
Did you mean to say that 97% of cheerleaders are women?
Yes. Did I say that wrong?
Yeah.
Thank you, Lynn. Thank you, Lynn.
You said
yes,
97% of women are cheerleaders.
No.
No. Okay.
No.
Keeping you honest.
No.
Keeping you honest.
Yes, thank you, Lynn. No, 97% of cheerleaders are women. And so we think of cheerleading as feminine. It's what girls do. It's a deeply feminine activity. But in fact, from the beginning of cheerleading that started in the early 19th century, it was what men did. It was a predominantly male activity, and it was in fact thought of as not just what men do, but as a deeply masculine, manly activity. So just to kind of demonstrate this is a quote from 1911 from a prominent magazine talking about cheerleading. And I'm going to have to remind you throughout, because like our ideas about cheerleaders and as women are so embedded. So I'm going to keep reminding you, like, no, we're talking about men. When we talk about cheerleading right now, we're talking about men, not women. So this is a magazine from 1911, and this is a quote. The reputation of having been a valiant cheerleader is one of the most valuable things a boy can take away from college. As a title to promotion in professional or public life, it ranks hardly second to that of having been a quarterback. So think about that, right? Cheerleaders are valiant, they're valuable. It's almost as good as being a quarterback in terms of launching you into success after college. So think about in 1911, what they're saying is, here's the quarterback, here's a cheerleader. They're about, you know, maybe a little bit beneath, but about the same. And we're gonna come back to this quote for what it kind of tells us about cheerleading in the past. So cheerleading starts in 1894 is the first cheerleading squad. It's at the University of Pennsylvania. Cheerleaders had their own national fraternity. It was called Gamma Sigma. And again, this is all men. Every year they would pick an all-American cheer squad, and that would be the cheerleaders in the fraternity, along with sports journalists. So going back to, is cheerleading a sport or not? Think about it's sports journalists who are picking this all-American team. And there's an all-American cheerleading team, the same way there's an all-American football team. So clearly it's thought of as something like a sport, at least close to a sport, if not exactly a sport, that sports journalists are picking it. So we're going to talk about up until about World War II, cheerleaders are almost all men. And so I want us to think about how was cheerleading different when it was all men who were doing it. So we're going to look at a few pictures, a few historical pictures of men cheerleading. And I want you to think about, as we look at this, what's different about men as cheerleaders. Okay, so here's our first picture. So this is the Yale cheerleading squad. And I believe these are the Jayhawks, or Kansas, because they've got the little Jayhawk there. And then here's Yale again. Let's look at these pictures. What's different? Let's start with what's different about, like, what looks different about men as cheerleaders? And then again, unmute yourself, just go for it.
I think that they have clothes on.
They did, Lauren, they did.
and dress shoes.
Yeah. Yeah, what else? Yeah, I love these pictures because you know, not only do they have clothes on, but you know, look, they've got little bow ties and sweaters. They look like maybe like golfers, or they're about to play cricket. I like this guy's very shiny, like dress shoes he appears to have on. He's got on a belt. Yeah, they have clothes on. Is there anything else that looks different?
Didn't see any pom-poms, but that may have been a later addition.
Yeah, we didn't see pom-poms. We saw some megaphones, which is something you'd see cheerleaders with, but yes, no pom-poms. What's the same? What looks the same about what they're doing?
The moves,
Yeah.
you know, the activity.
Yeah, exactly, Jeff. They're doing routines, right? I mean, they don't, you know, I don't want to disparage these guys, but they don't look quite as coordinated as I think modern cheerleaders would look. Like you hear, like, you know, they're not all together. I think if we were judging them in cheerleading, we'd be like, you need to work on your moves a little bit, but they are moving around. What else looks the same? Yeah, Ashley?
The predominantly like whiteness of the sport.
Yeah.
It was a very particular kind of man.
Yeah, white dudes. You know, thin, able-bodied white dudes. You know, we don't know their sexuality, but you know, think about they're comparing to the quarterback. At this point, there's no like association between men cheerleading and their sexual identity. So there's not this assumption that if you're a cheerleader, you must be gay as a man. Yeah. Anything else that's similar? Yeah, that's good. So, you know, the big thing that's different is how they dress. Like Lauren said, they're covered, right? They're, you know, they're in long pants. They almost always wore all white. What's the same is that they were expected to yell and be loud and lead cheers, right? That was their role. They moved around. They did routines. You saw them doing like their little routine. They would, you know, raise their fist and cheer. You saw the guys leaping into the air. When cheerleading started, there wasn't as much gymnastics involved. But interestingly, it was University of Kentucky that first started including gymnastics as part of cheerleading. Maybe not surprising. They have a reputation as a very good cheerleading program, even today. And so University of Kentucky, eventually you had to take a 3-week tumbling class before you could become a cheerleader. And that was again as a man. So they're doing all the same things. They're dressed differently. And what they're doing is rocketing them to prestige once they graduate from college. And just in case you don't believe me about this prestige that came with being a cheerleader, right? We've got that quote from the magazine. We're going to play a little game. 4 presidents, American presidents, were cheerleaders in college. So I only have pictures of 2 of them, but I'm going to show you the pictures and see if you can guess which president this is. Who is it? Does anyone unmute themselves? Anybody? Ashley, you're
Reagan, because he's got an A. Didn't
Oh, that's
Reagan go to
close.
Aurora-
That's close.
Oh, I thought he went to Aurora College or something.
It's not Reagan.
It
Anybody
looks
else want
like
to guess?
Bush. Looks like
What?
George Bush.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
It's
Oh
W.
my God, George.
It's W. Does anybody remember hearing this? I remember hearing people talking about W a little bit. That he was a cheerleader.
Where is that though? I thought he went to Yale.
I'm not exactly sure where he's cheerleading. Yeah, it might have been high school. It might have been in
Probably.
Dallas. I'm gonna guess who this is.
Ronnie Reagan.
Yep. There he is, Ronald Reagan. The other 2 presidents who were cheerleaders, Dwight D. Eisenhower and FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, before polio was a cheerleader in college. But not just presidents. Here's Trent Lott, Mississippi Senator, as a cheerleader. Rick
Oh my.
Perry,
Wow.
Texas governor and presidential candidate, and Mitt Romney, also presidential candidate. Now, the interesting thing, we talked a little bit about how language is important. So Ronald Reagan probably would have called himself a cheerleader. W did too. You can think about the kind of transition we're going to talk about. It takes about 20 to 30 years from cheerleading to go from all men to all women. So if you're of that older generation, you would have been cheering with other men, and it would have been this cheerleading that launches you into prestige after you graduate from college. But for people like specifically Rick Perry and I think Trent Lott, it's not cool in 2022 to have been a cheerleader in college as a man, right? And especially maybe as a conservative politician, right? You know, this reputation, that's a girly thing to do. That might make you your sexual identity a little suspect. So when people like Trent Lott and Rick Perry talk about, they were not cheerleaders in college. Can you guess what they say they were? They weren't cheerleaders. Yeah, Kate?
Cheer squad.
Squad is good. Yeah. Pep squad.
Yeah.
They were pep squad. They were Yale leaders. So, again, language, they were doing the exact same thing cheerleaders do, but they were not cheerleaders. They were on the pep squad or they were Yale leaders. So they were doing something different. Okay, so how does cheerleading go from all men and men who go on to become presidents and senators to something that is now thought of as a deeply girly thing? The first women start showing up in as cheerleaders in the 1930s. They're not allowed to be on the All-American squad. That was still just for men. And there was a lot of hostility towards women entering cheerleader. So, for example, the University of Pittsburgh banned any women cheerleaders up until 1954. They didn't let any women cheer at University of Pittsburgh. And the arguments people made about why women couldn't be cheerleaders were basically kind of in 2 areas. That one, they lacked the skills, so they just weren't good enough to be cheerleaders. And 2, cheerleading would make women too masculine for their own good. So the lack the skills part. They argued that women couldn't do the gymnastics that was part of cheerleading. It's kind of funny to think about now, right? They weren't athletic enough to flip in the air which, you know, as people who, yeah, women, they're not athletic enough to do gymnastics or to flip in the air, you know, when this is what we're used to seeing cheerleaders do now. So they didn't have the physical ability. They couldn't do the gymnastics, couldn't do the flips. The second part, cheerleaders have to yell, right? Cheerleaders have to be loud. And they were afraid all the yelling would result in something that they literally called hog choleritis. So think hog like pig, and then choleritis, like, you know, like, I don't know, like a disease. So it would give women hog choleritis. It would turn them into, it would make them have loud, raucous voices that were not appropriate for young ladies. Cheerleading would also make them overly conceited, because if you think about, cheerleaders are almost like the quarterback. You don't want women being in that prestigious position. And if you think about the shouting and being loud, the hog choleritis, hog choleritis, that's hard to say. Cheerleading is one of the few places in society where women are both allowed to be loud and they're supposed to be loud, right? They're supposed to yell. And so think about how unladylike that is. And, you know, there's a little bit of intersectionality here, especially for kind of white middle class, right? You know, you don't want to be loud. You want to be ladylike, and yelling is not ladylike. So basically, they were afraid that if women entered into cheerleading, it would be too hard for them and it would turn them into men. So there's a lot of hostility towards women in cheerleading. Now, up until this point, what are women doing who aren't cheerleading, right? So they're not allowed to cheer. What are they doing? They're playing sports, but the sports looks very different from what we think of women's sports today. And again, there's a little bit of intersectionality here in terms of what kind of woman you are. So if you're a woman who didn't go to college, if you were kind of working class woman, if you were going to play sports, you played sports for a league. So think of like the softball leagues that are sponsored by the, you know, the bar or the pizzeria. You know, those existed, and a lot of working class women would play for those. It wasn't professional, though sometimes it got a little, you know, like, you know, slipping some money under the table. If anyone has anybody ever heard of Babe Diedrichson or Babe Diedrichson Zacharias? Yeah, Kate's heard of her. So more people should have heard of her. She's an amazing, like, multi-sport athlete who dominated golf in the early 20th century. She started out playing in those leagues. She started out playing basketball, and then eventually transitioned to golf and dominated women's golf. So if you're a working class woman, you would be playing in those leagues. If you're a white woman going to college or university, you would play sports, but again, here the idea was you could play sports, but you couldn't be too competitive, you couldn't be too aggressive, you couldn't be too physical, because I'm not exaggerating here. Literally, they were afraid it would shrink your womb, right? It would make you infertile if you were too competitive. So you could play, but you had to play nicely. So literally the way this worked is, say Hanover and Franklin are going to play each other, the women's team in basketball. You know, Franklin might travel to Hanover and everybody would get together, but instead of Hanover's team playing Franklin's team, they would mix it up. And so people would put on their little pennies, and there would be a blue team and a red team, but they would both be mixed Hanover and Franklin players, right? Because you didn't want to get too competitive, and they'd play. And if anyone has ever looked up the rules for women's basketball early on, again, it looked very different. They weren't allowed to dribble. They didn't want them running too much. So they would play a very non-competitive, non-aggressive game. And then afterwards, they would get together and have tea. Because the idea was, it was a social thing, right? So we're doing a little physical activity and then we're socializing, but we're not being competitive or aggressive. And so that's kind of white women who are at colleges and universities. The interesting exception here is African-American women at HBCUs were actually competing. And this is why in the kind of early and mid 20th century, you see a lot of African-American women dominating in track and field at the Olympics level, because they they had been competing. They hadn't been doing these play dates. Those norms around femininity, kind of weren't enforced or applied at HBCUs. And so their women's sports program tended to be stronger. Interestingly, as a side note, women's sports got more competitive and aggressive. So eventually there's Title IX in the 70s. But before that, women's sports gets more competitive and aggressive after World War II, because the Cold War, suddenly the Olympics become, the way in which we demonstrate that we're better than the Soviet Union. And so suddenly, like, winning the most medals becomes very important. And we're like, oh crap, we got to have good women to win the medal race and beat the commies. So women's sports becomes more competitive, kind of in response to the Cold War. Okay, I should have said, at any point, if anybody has any questions, if I'm going too fast, or if you need to correct me, Lynn, because I said something wrong, let me know. Okay, so what changed? Like a lot of things in the United States, it has to do with World War II, but not exactly in the way that you would expect. So the narrative isn't that men leave and women kind of enter into cheerleading to take their place. What happens is that colleges and universities during World War II, they scale back on all extracurricular activities and sports that are seen as non-essential. And you can imagine, like, whose activities are going to be seen as non-essential. It's women's sports and women's activities that are seen as non-essential. So by 1943, most colleges had either eliminated or reduced their women's sports programs. So these women who had been used to playing, even though it wasn't super competitive, but they've been used to doing, some sports stuff. All of a sudden, all their activities have been taken away. Cheerleading hasn't been taken away because it's seen as a masculine thing. So it's still kind of a priority. So because cheerleading hadn't been cut, that kind of created an opportunity for women to enter into cheerleading, because it was still around while the rest of their activities had been cut. So this starts in World War II. It takes, again, like about 2 decades after that for cheerleading to completely flip over and to become a feminine activity and to become mostly women. So the other question is, like, what happens when an activity goes from being something that men do and defined as masculine to something that women do and defined as feminine? And I want to go back to that quote about cheerleading and ask you, I'm going to read it again, and I want you to think about, do you think any of this applies once women start cheerleading, once cheerleading becomes seen as something women do instead of something men do? So this is a quote from 1911. The reputation of having been a valiant cheerleader is one of the most valuable things a boy can take away from college. As a title to promotion in professional public life, it ranks hardly second to that of having been a quarterback. What do you think? When women start cheerleading, is it seen that way? No, not so much. Yeah. So what changed once women started cheerleading? It's no longer seen as masculine, obviously. So the association now is feminine. And that seems like a really obvious point, but I want to come back to it because think about, like, it was seen as one of the manliest things you could do. And then in 20 years, it's seen as one of the least masculine or manly things you can do. It's seen as one of the most feminine things. Yeah, Lauren.
Well, I just wonder if that's a regional thing or because my husband was a college cheerleader at Bradley University in Illinois. And I don't ever remember him talking about, it'll be interesting to ask him, he's not home yet, but it'll be interesting to ask him if he ever felt that way. Yeah. Because everything I've heard is that, it was a valuable thing, a strong, you got to lift those girls up and blah, blah, blah. Yeah. And I also grew up in a small town in Kentucky, 30 miles east of Lexington. So cheerleading is huge, like you alluded to back at UK, and had several high school friends, men, who went on to become UK cheerleaders. And again, it was it was a vaulted position there. So I wonder if, and now I'm in Texas. And so, I mean, football is king for
Yeah.
sure. And
Yeah.
a lot of our friends here will give my husband a hard time. You're a cheerleader. So if
Yeah.
it is these pockets where, like anything, where
Yeah.
different things are valued, different places and whatnot, it's, I've never really thought about it being a purely feminine sport,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
I guess depending on what your experience is.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. I think there are definitely variations by like big geography, but also just by kind of individual schools and the cultures of what their cheerleaders are like. Yeah, Beth, was there something you wanted to say?
Well, in that 20-year span that you described, having been masculine and power oriented, to the swing that you're saying, with the exceptions of some male population within that women's sport, I mean, it immediately went to the parochial view of a female needing to be protected, not having the acumen, ability, stamina. I mean, you could
Yeah.
probably go on any particular characteristic. I mean, and you certainly weren't valued as a just below the level of a quarterback.
Right. Yeah,
But
exactly.
with a marketable title in the career world. It's phenomenal to hear you say that. In 20 years, it's switched completely.
Mhm.
And developed all the mores that we had seen before.
Yeah, Lynn,
Interesting.
thanks.
I think Division I cheerleaders definitely have the male is still seen as, valuable, and nothing pointed it out more than the IU cheerleaders this year in March Madness, and how much press they got for picking the ball off the backboard.
Yeah.
And it couldn't have happened without a strong guy who could lift up the small female cheerleader. So I still think that D1 especially, those male cheerleaders are still a valued part of the squad. And they definitely look for guys who have been athletes in high school, and probably not all cheerleaders, and they teach them how to do those skills to be able to lift and catch and all those things.
And it's funny you say that, because my husband did an audition to be a cheerleader. He was helping his friend who was a female audition, and she didn't make it, but they said, hey, but we really need more men. Can you come? You know, that your all's point about how it's changed so much over the years, and again, being here in Texas with football, our demographics, at least where I live, I'm in the DFW area, are changing very quickly. And I've always wondered about football, where it's going to be in 50 years here, because the people moving in aren't into it as much. A barbaric sport.
Well, I wanted to, one other thing too on this topic, I wanted to either ask or comment on the prestige thing, because I tend to, listen to the question and go, oh, specifically the question you raised, the point you made is when there was the initial switch from predominantly male to predominantly female. I don't know what the prestige issue was like, and certainly it didn't match the quarterback thing. But it seemed like in fairly short order after that, and for a decent period of time, there was at least some prestige, maybe a different type of prestige associated with cheerleading, even when it was female dominated. There was some thought that the women that are selected to be cheerleaders were, particularly good, capable, competent. And I felt like during that period of time, that was also going to translate into some kind of career advantage, because they were viewed by being selected for those roles, having a certain set of not only physical characteristics, but mental and emotional characteristics too, that might be appealing in the workplace. So I, at least when I was in college, I thought of being a cheerleader, a female cheerleader, is a prestige position.
Yes, yeah,
you know?
yeah. And we'll talk about it. We'll talk in a minute. Like, you know, so prestige, maybe prestige that's a little different. So not prestige
Right.
that you're going to become president, but prestige that you're popular, that you're pretty. And you know, obviously what you're all saying is absolutely true. Like, so cheerleading is never a monolithic thing, right? It's different in different places. And there's some research that suggests, and I'm, you know, I don't know enough about cheerleading or remember, but that there are two different national organizations, and what kind of masculinity and femininity look like in those two big organizations are very different. So one of them emphasizes more of the athletic, and there you get men that are like, you know, like Lynn was saying, sometimes they're football players or they're athletes in other sports who also cheer. The other organization emphasizes more the kind of dance component of cheerleading, and in that organization, you know, the men who cheer there is a kind of stigma of femininity, or it attracts more men who are gay, right? Because you can think of, you know, gymnastics, right? You know, masculine, but kind of dancing around, you know, not particularly seen as masculine. But yeah, you're absolutely right. It differs depending on where you are. So cheerleading is never kind of one thing. So just going back to talking about what changed with cheerleading, it was no longer seen as masculine. You know, not quite the, you know, launching you into a presidential career or to become a senator. It becomes seen as a kind of less important activity on campus, and the athleticism, the athletic part gets de-emphasized, and what gets emphasized instead is the kind of sexualization. So I think that was Lauren, right? They're wearing less clothes. So cheerleaders, instead of being future leaders, are seen as pretty and sexy, and so obviously their costumes change. So we go from, you know, these guys in their long pants and sweaters and bow ties to these are fairly conservative cheerleading costumes, but you can see there's a lot more skin exposed. And then we get the Dallas Cowboys, right? A lot of skin exposed, very skinny, wearing makeup, a certain kind of body type. And like I said, so all this happens within a couple of decades. And I just want to talk real quick about, so, you know, cheerleading is interesting. What's interesting about it is you know, depending on where you are, if you think of cheerleading as feminine, this history that it was ever seen as masculine is kind of erased, right? The idea that all cheerleaders were once men isn't something that a lot of people know anymore. So that history has kind of disappeared. But in a kind of big picture sense, what does this tell us about gender in general or gender in sports? And there's kind of three lessons I want to talk about. The first is that no activity is inherently masculine or feminine. So, you know, cheerleading, which many of us think of today as very feminine, was once thought of as the pinnacle of masculinity. And we see that happen with occupations that change over time. So teaching was an occupation that was once thought of as masculine. Now, especially the younger the child, thought of as predominantly feminine. So no activity is inherently masculine or feminine, and that includes physical activities, right? Because, you know, think about going back, the arguments that women cannot cheer because they can't do acrobatics, they can't do gymnastics, and people were convinced that was true. So nothing is inherently masculine or feminine. We know that from history, how things change, their definition of a masculine and feminine over time. We know that when we compare across cultures, that almost everything that's seen as masculine in some place is probably seen as feminine someplace else. So nothing is inherently masculine or feminine. Two, so, you know, that's fine if like we segregate men and women, and men are doing this over here and women are doing this over here. That's absolutely fine, except when women are all doing something, it tends to be devalued relative to when men are all doing something. So when men were cheerleading, it was like being the quarterback, and it got you to the presidency. When women are cheerleading, Jeff was saying it still has some prestige attached. But, I think we'd be hard pressed to find a quote where we talk about, hey, become a cheerleader in college and you'll become president of the United States, right? So when women are together doing a thing, it is seen as less valuable than when men are doing a thing. That's the second point. Third point, separating activities by gender recreates this idea that gender is important. So why isn't there a moment where, so cheerleaders are 97% women today. Why isn't there a moment when women enter into cheerleading and some of the men stick around and it becomes a mixed gender activity? I would argue it's because gender segregation kind of helps us believe that gender is important. So the idea of cheerleading as a very feminine activity reinforces our ideas about femininity, just the way that when cheerleading was a very masculine activity, it reinforced our ideas about masculinity. So one of the purposes of gender segregation is to kind of keep us believing in gender, that it's important and that it matters. So that's kind of the third point. I will take anybody's questions. I have a question to throw out to you if you want to answer, but if you have questions for me. So given what we talked about here with gender segregation and cheerleading, I don't know, this might be a bomb to throw it out, but should sports be gender segregated? Should people of different genders be able to play together? That's my question for y'all. Y'all can avoid it and ask me something, or.
Well, I guess I'll start with a comment. Actually, I was trying to turn on my video. It's an interesting question. It's actually what I came to the session for, because that's obviously been a hot topic in the news, and I just wanted to see what somebody that had thought about it a lot more than me had to say about the topic. But it strikes me is, I think the answer to the question is a really hard one, in that it seems like sports should be gender separated if the people in the various genders kind of come to a consensus that they want it to be. You know what I mean? It's like, I don't know that it's something that can be determined from an edict on high, but some things do happen in society, life, and culture that you do kind of get there through a consensus building over time. Now, as you just mentioned, the consensus changes on lots of things and has changed on lots of things, but it kind of seems all right to me that if there is a consensus that men prefer to play against men and women prefer to play against women, that is to some degree okay, but obviously it's not, there's nothing written in stone, and if they prefer to play together, and that there are some places where I'm not sure if there's super highly competitive remunerated sports. I'm trying to think of any where they play together, but there are many recreational sports where the genders have decided, yes, we want to play this sport together,
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
It's kind of a consensus thing, it seems like to me.
Yeah, and I think consensus. So consensus is nice if everyone really is agreed, or some people being heard by that consensus. Is that consensus changing? I think you're right that in recreational leagues, men and women are more likely to play together, and then you can ask, like, why is that? Is it because it seems like nothing's at stake? So it's okay for men and women to play together when there's no athletic scholarships or money or, or those types of things on the line. The sports where men and women do play together or compete together, horse racing, car racing, Indy and NASCAR, Quidditch, though they're renaming Quidditch, but Quidditch is mixed gender from Harry Potter. Ultimate Frisbee. Not all ultimate Frisbee, but a lot of ultimate Frisbee is co-ed. I think those are the main ones. So wrestling is kind of, there are girls who wrestle at the high school level, though some high schools are now starting to segregate that. So yeah, there are a few out there. And you're going to be like, why those? Is there some reason why it makes more sense for women to be able to compete, women and men to be able to compete in those sports than others? You know, yeah, I don't know. Lynn, what were you going to say?
2 points. One about the recreational sports like golf, bowling. They have handicaps. So they have added that in to make the competition a little bit more, make it a little bit more competitive if you want to do that. And then the other part I wanted to say is, I do think it's important to have the segregated sports, because I think if we didn't, just by the physicality, that the men would dominate. And I think up until a certain point, when I was growing up, I wasn't allowed to play Little League. My younger brothers all could, but girls couldn't at that point. Now you can, girls can do that. So up to a certain point, probably high school age, women can, or girls can compete and do very well against guys. But then at that point, just the physicality takes over. And if we didn't have separate sports, we might have 5 or 6 women in college being able to play something. And now we have hundreds.
So there's a real argument there about what would happen to equality in terms of men and women. On the flip side of that, right? Like what do we do with as the hot topic is what do we do with trans women and trans men, and even more than trans men and trans women, intersex women. Well, I shouldn't even say trans men, because mostly it's about trans women. So most of the patrolling is not about people who were assigned female at birth trying to compete as men. People aren't really worried about that. They're worried about people who were assigned male at birth competing as women, because the assumption is that if you were assigned a female at birth, you don't have any advantage. And I will just say that there's a little bit of sexism right there, right? The idea that like women can never beat men. Of course, when we look at various physical differences, there are average differences. Men are on average taller than women. That doesn't mean that all men are taller than all women. Men are on average faster than women. That doesn't mean that all men are faster than all women. But yeah, we have to balance gender equity with trans women, intersex women, and then it gets even more complicated when we talk about non-binary or agender or gender neutral people who don't identify as either men or women. And so even if you allow a non-binary person to play on the women's team, well, now they're playing as an identity that doesn't express who they are. So yeah, it's a tough situation to figure out how to balance all that. And I think Jeff was talking about how there's consensus, but consensus changes. I don't know, there might need to be a reckoning of the consensus about, well, what is the purpose of sports, right? If sports is really supposed to be for everyone, how can we reconfigure sports in a way that it really is for everyone? And instead of where we are now, which we seem to be, patrolling who can and can't play. What other folks, questions or other? Yeah, Ashley?
I think 2 things. The advantage question and kind of the advantage concern or defense against trans athletes is always really fascinating to me, because that's the name of sports. Like it's not considered an advantage for Michael Phelps, whose entire body was perfectly designed for him to succeed as a swimmer, or an advantage when you have a severe height ability or large hands to go in and play basketball. And then those are athletes we celebrate and we give Olympic medals to, and and they have tremendous financial success in our world. And so I think that discussion of advantage really, in my mind, only ever comes into play when you're trying to argue against allowing a transgender person to participate in athletics. And then I think Lynn's question about equality is a really fascinating one, just in terms of would then women still have the same access to sports opportunities? And one thing that you mentioned, Dr. Ryle, was Quidditch. And one thing that Quidditch is designed around is what they call their 9 3/4 rule, or their gender rule, which is that you have to have a balance of gender and who you're allowing to play. So the refs will monitor how many men are on the field at the same time as women. And that's how they try to create it so coaches aren't just then putting in all of their male players. And so that has been something that they've been trying to kind of figure out how to counterbalance the gender equity piece when you do have an all gender sport. So that's been kind of fascinating to see how they allow that to play out. But those were just my comments.
Yeah. And Ashley's point, so some people have speculated that Michael Phelps has something called Marfan syndrome, which results in like very, long limber arms and legs that gives him an advantage in swimming. There are lots of other kind of genetic advantages that athletes have. Yes, basketball players tend to be taller. Baseball players tend to have perfect eyesight, so they can kind of see the ball. And so, a lot of people raise the question, why are we singling out this one genetic piece that is related to gender, but isn't determined by gender, right? This is the problem with Caster Semenya, who is not a trans woman. She is, as far as we know, intersex, an intersex woman. So what the international and the IAF, it's the Track and Field International Organization, has told her is that in order to compete as a woman, she has to take drugs to lower her naturally occurring levels of testosterone, or she won't be able to compete as a woman. So that's she's not doping. This is how she was born. It's how intersex variations are as common as with some estimates 1 in 1,000. So a lot of people are intersex, and if they want to compete as the gender that they were born, people are telling them, no, you have to change who you are. You have to take drugs to change who you are in order to compete. Yeah. Kara, what's your question?
Yeah, I have like a comment that I would love your opinion on. So I work in the Title IX world, and one of the most interesting things to me about the trans athletes argument is that no one cares about women's sports until it involves what they see as a man. And I find that so interesting. And like, for example, Brittany Griner, the WNBA player who has been, in prison in Russia and was in there for 2 months and no one knew. Just think if that was like LeBron James, the difference in like, reaction. So I just think it's so interesting just being in the Title IX world that no one can name like what is the WNBA team in Indiana. But if you ask them, they know who the Pacers are. But then as soon as you mention maybe a man, I just think it's interesting and love, if you have any thoughts on it.
I do. A lot of people argue that the organizations that are passing these bills to prohibit trans women and girls and intersex women and girls from competing in sport, they're the same organizations that were fighting to keep gay marriage from being made legal. So it's not confusing like kind of what their agenda is. And a lot of people, so they don't, so their argument is we have to protect women in sports, but they don't really care about women in sports. Title IX was very important for women's equality in sports, and it fundamentally changed the terrain of higher education. I mean, Lynn is absolutely right. A lot of people suspect that the higher rates that women graduate from high school, college, and graduate school, that's sports. Like sports got women on university and college campuses in huge numbers. But still today, there are, I think, the 1.6 million fewer opportunities for girls to play high school sports than there are for boys. So we haven't reached equality. And, you know, there's a little bit of, if you really care about girls and women in sports, then maybe address that rather than kind of picking on this issue of trans women and intersex women trying to play sports. We're not there yet. We're a lot, in the US is a lot better with Title IX with gender equality in sports, but we've got a long way to go.
Bridget has had her hand up for a really long time.
Yeah, that's okay. It's like kind of light in that corner.
Yeah.
Anyway, so thanks. I was thinking a lot about the sports I've played, and I would love to see all gender sports. You know, like I think it'd be really cool. It'd be interesting. I think about people having different abilities, and like, you know, so I played basketball for a long time. I loved it, you know, and I was like taller than my second grade teacher when I was in the second grade. So my dad was my coach, and he just like put me in the center of the court and was like, don't move, raise your arms. And I was the best center because I was so tall. But we also needed people who were small and swift, who were forwards, who can run back and forth, you know. So I think about body differences and how body differences can help you within one sport. I think we're way too socially threatened to think about that for a major sport like football. It would never happen in the NFL, but I would love to see it, you know, in college or high school. My dad has been very involved in college football his whole life, and there are women who are kickers in college. It happens, but it's hush hush, you know, like even for people who love a school, follow a school, they may not realize that that's a woman who's going out onto the field just to kick, and then she's leaving the field.
Yeah.
But it's kind of quiet, you know, it's not, we don't want to ruffle any feathers. This is a very masculine sport. So I don't know. I think it's the social barriers that would keep it from happening.
Yeah. Well, one suggestion people have made is that is kind of going where you're going, Bridget, is that you know, so gender isn't a determinant of athletic ability. So the relationship is loose and it's kind of complicated. So the research on, even if you just single out the relationship between testosterone and athletic ability, it's kind of complicated, which makes sense because if you think of athletic ability, it's not just, you know, how many what hormones you have or how tall you are. I mean, it's how hard did you work and how motivated. One of the things people point out is if you're a woman, you're never going to make that much at your sport. You know, so the average NBA salary, I can't remember what it was, but I don't even think it's 100,000. So you just, you know, if athletic ability even has a small relationship to motivation and reward, then women are already at a disadvantage. And so maybe we should have leagues that are based on ability rather than gender. See, Bridget's right. Yeah, Lauren?
To Bridget's point, I wonder, do y'all ever think we'll ever get to a point where it's kind of like back to middle school where we have an A team, a B team, you know, a C team, regardless of gender, just based on athleticism toward that position, whether it's kicker, quarterback, forward, whatever. But do you see that happening maybe as gender becomes more of a discussion point, at least?
Yeah, maybe. You know, so I think I know that the MLB, so Major League Baseball and the NFL have both said that they don't have a policy that prohibits women. So if women could make the teams, they could play. And I'm not 100% sure, but I'm pretty sure I saw there was a woman playing on a minor league team in the United States. There's certainly women who have played professional baseball in Japan. A woman has tried out for the NFL. A woman hasn't made the team yet, but yeah, I could see that happening. You know, the interesting thing is that It's becoming more common for boys and girls to play together. Lynn kind of talked about when they're younger. And so you think about if that generation gets used to that, then, you could see them kind of being like, why do we stop? Why do we stop playing together? Yeah,
And
Kate?
it's interesting, our high school here, we're a one school town, and it's huge, big Texas high school. It's about, it's 1,000 per grade level. And we have a girl kicker, and she's a little celebrity in our town. So that's new for us. So that's kind of exciting that she's so celebrated. Yeah.
Lynn said in the chat, if anybody didn't see, that Hanover had a female kicker a few years ago. Yeah, Kate?
Robyn, do we ever worry about male athletes maybe being intersex? I mean, I can't ever remember a news story about that. It's
no, we don't worry about that. We've never all the organizations that have ever done gender testing, they've never done gender testing of men. It's only of women.
And so what I feel like is that, I know people talk about it in terms of making fair competition for women, but I feel like we're freaking out because we can't really define what a woman is. Yep. We're okay, men. I mean, go hang around, be any kind of man you want, but Jesus, you really got to toe the line, or we're not going to call you a woman. Yes. Like the track athlete that you were just talking about.
Caster Semenya. Yeah. If you want a little case study in how biological sex is socially constructed just as much as gender is socially constructed, all you have to do is read the history of gender testing in the Olympics, and that's a chapter in the book, and it is horrifying. There's a period where they make women athletes just line up naked in front of doctors. And then they evolved from that to springing gynecological exams on them. So they'd go into a room, they'd have no idea what was going to happen. And there would be a doctor who was doing a gynecological exam. Eventually they moved.
Make sure you had a vagina? I mean, is that what we were checking?
Yeah. Eventually they moved to chromosome tests. But what they found is that so many women had some kind of variation in their chromosomes that didn't line up perfectly with XXXY, that they threw that out too. What they do now, and this is where gender and race and kind of nationality intersect. What they do now is, if you're suspicious, then they test you. And so what a lot of people argue is you don't see white or European women athletes in the Olympics ever being tested. It's women like Caster Semenya, who is African, Judy Chand, who is Indian. And so there's this kind of, if you are a woman of color, you already don't look feminine in the way that white women do. And so now, if you perform better than they think you're supposed to, you're suspect, and then you get tested.
I had a comment about what you just said about the gynecological exams being sprung on women, thinking about, also, we're saying we want to protect women and safety of women and girls. And it made me think about the whole Larry Nassar case and, putting doctors up on a pedestal and, this is very competitive. This is maybe your profession. So the risk that we're putting girls and women at who have to be having those exams sprung on them and their whole career on the line. Yeah, sure. It's about keeping girls safe.
What happens there? Yes, and some women have, in the past in international competition, if they get flagged, or if they're afraid they're going to get flagged for testing, their international organization will send them to doctors that do invasive procedures. There have been women who have had clitoridectomies, like had their clitoris removed, so that they would be safe to compete as women, just in case. So yeah, it's a really nasty history there in terms of gender testing. And these laws in the United States for like we do not want to get into that with high school with children. You don't want to go down that road of being in a position to try and prove who is a woman and who isn't, because you kind of can't. Any other questions?
Of course, I read your book and loved it. But the part that surprised me, I mean, there were many facts that I didn't know, and so that was really interesting. But I hadn't really thought about colonialism and sports, and that was just, wow, that was fascinating.
Yeah. I mean, check it out. But the gist is like you can trace colonial history around the globe by seeing who plays what sport where. So where the British went, people play cricket. So the biggest cricket match in the world is now between India and Pakistan, and that's British colonialism. Where the US kind of had sway, you see more baseball. And so the chapter kind of talks about there's a World Baseball Classic, which is like the World Cup with soccer, only it's with baseball. And one year the Dutch team won, and you're like, wait, the Dutch, why are the Dutch so good at baseball? But it's because one of their former territories is this tiny island in the Caribbean called Curacao, and they have the highest per capita number of players in Major League Baseball. So Curacao, they play baseball like mad. And because they were a former territory of the Netherlands, they can play for the Dutch team in the World Baseball Classic. So they kick our ass in baseball because they've got like these amazing MLB players from Curacao. Thank you, Lynn. Lynn said she wanted to read all my books. Any other questions?
Dr. Ryle, I was curious about all of the different kind of politicians and presidents you were showing. Do you think there's any kind of, similar to Lauren's point about regionality, do you think there was any connection primarily to white private elite educations, or is it more conservative educations or populations? Or that was really fascinating to me, that it was a very specific politician that would be shown. And so I was just kind of curious.
I don't know. I don't think Bill Clinton was a cheerleader. I don't think Barack Obama was. I think so if you go back far enough, like Eisenhower and FDR, that's just a generational thing. But then maybe W and Rick Perry, maybe it's a Texas Southern, that's a Texas thing. I don't know, like, where's Mitt Romney from? Is it Utah or? Yeah,
I believe Utah.
Yeah. It might be like, are you from like a big state with a big football program? I don't know exactly what's going on there. Ashley, that's an interesting point that I hadn't thought about, the connection there. I don't have that answer. It might have to do with regional variations and the prestige associated with cheerleading. Anybody else?
Do you think we'll go toward unsegregated professional sports in your lifetime? Not in my lifetime, clearly, but what about your lifetime?
Maybe in small corners. Not anything, will I see all sports desegregated by gender in my lifetime? No.
And do you think it's trans people trans women, that are going to be are going to force the issue ultimately?
Or canary in a coal mine? I don't know. I really, it's interesting, it's interesting because to me, like, trans women, because because they're trans feminine, if you can get past the objections of these organizations that are trying to pass the law, then there's a space for them in theory, right? Because they're women and they want to play women's sports. What really is the more difficult problem is the people who don't identify as feminine or masculine. And I just I read someone, they can have their own league. They can have their own league. Like, the non-binary people can all play together. And I'm like, no, that's not gonna work. That's just not gonna work.
Mm-hmm.
I'll be curious to kind of Dr. Ryle's earlier perspective about kind of the generational differences. I'll be curious if that ends up playing a role, especially when I think about how much money talks, and that if Hanover, for example, in 30 years isn't going to have the same donors it has now. And so if that is going to get to impact how Hanover then approaches sports, and then who gets the new locker rooms and the best equipment, and so I wonder if in 30, 40 years, that's going to look drastically different for institutions. And so if that is what will predominantly end up forcing the change, is I'm not going to give my money to this because it looks this way.
Right, maybe. Yeah. I mean, I certainly think that, as someone who's taught gender for 20 years, my students now are much more open. They're obviously much more open to issues of sexual identity, but they're also, more open about, people being trans and non-binary. So yeah, Ashley, maybe, I'll be retired.
Yeah, I was laughing at Lynn's comment.
Actually, that's hopeful.
I'll comment again too on this, and I don't know if my video is working. For some reason, I lost everybody else's video, but maybe my video is working. I still think it comes back to what will happen in the future. If people can manage to still be willing to talk to one another, which is obviously getting harder and harder, is that which is terrible, which is a horrible thing, is that ultimately these things will seem to get resolved in a very messy, uneven way that will be around consensus as values, revise, change, update, all the things you said, generational change. And I just think it's all extremely hard to predict how it will go. But the key will be people, to have good liberal arts educations from Hanover College, and they're willing to, be open-minded about things like, one of the things, again, why I dialed in and, a current issue, I just think all the Sturm and Drang going on now over transgender athletes is just massively, massively overwrought. But it is still going on. And again, I suppose there is an upside to it, although it's painful in the short term, but there's an upside to it because it does at least result in a conversation happening around the issue. And that gets back to the messy, goofy thing that I talked about. And kind of a kudos to Lynn Hall on a comment that she brought up, which I think is really important in all this, is, on the one hand, you look at equality around the notion of, oh, hey, are we separating people by gender for various activities? But on the other hand, the genderization of sports has produced a massively good thing in that result of more opportunities. Are there enough? I don't know, but more opportunities and more women playing sports, which I think is a unmitigated good in society. I think that's all been super, super positive for everything. So I just think the whole thing will be really, really messy, and it'll just be interesting to watch to see how it evolves.
Yeah. Social change. Yeah, social change is messy. Yeah.
Well, it looks like we're running a little short on time, so maybe we'll have one more question if there's any more.
Just thank you so much for sharing your research with us this evening. And I'm so excited to read the book. And I just love learning from all of your experience and knowledge. And thank you so much for being willing to share that with us.
Thank you, Ashley.
Thank you, Robyn.
You're welcome. Yeah, if you want to read more about all the things we talked about, Throw Like a Girl, Cheer Like a Boy, the evolution of gender identity and race in sports, you can get it, order it online.
Lynn wanted to know what your next book was.
So the paperback of She, He, They, Me is coming out. So that's a new edition of that is coming out June 10th. And then I'm talking to Sage, who published my gender textbook, about writing a sociology of sport textbook. So that will be next, which I'm very excited about, because I don't know if y'all can tell, but I like talking about sports. Thank you all so much.
Thank you all for coming. It was good to see everybody. I'll send out a thank you email with the recording in it as well. So if you guys want to rewatch it or share it, you're more than welcome to do that as well. So thank you so much for coming tonight.
Thank you. Bye, Emily. Bye, Bridget. See you, Ashley.
Thanks.